Well, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Michael Hertz. I teach here at the law school, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being the co-director of the Florsheim Center for Constitutional Democracy, under whose auspices this event is taking place. I just want to say a couple of words of welcome and then get out of the way. We're here to talk about law at the end of war, which is a kind of evocative title, a sort of slightly wistful thing. We are for both, right? It's nice to think that wars will end and that when they do, they will be constrained and defined by law. But wars do sometimes end. And this is not quite so pie in the sky as it might sound. I mean, the pie in the sky thing would be a world with no war, a world where law was unnecessary. Being hard-headed realists here, we're not talking about that world. There's this wonderful quote, just to free associate slightly, from Grant Gilmore in The Ages of American Law, where he says, "In heaven there shall be no law, and the lion will lie down with the lamb. In hell there will be nothing but law, and due process will be meticulously observed." So being hard-headed realists, we're going to talk about hell, not heaven tonight. I want to just say a couple of thank yous and put in a quick plug. The plug, of course, is for tomorrow's event at 7 p.m. in this room, and anyone interested in tonight's event should also be interested in tomorrow's event. There's information about it outside, and hope to see many of you back again. A couple of thank yous. First of all, the Cardozo Law Review has been very involved in tonight's event and even more involved in tomorrow's. I'm not going to mention all the people, but in particular Molly Duane, the editor-in-chief, and Pamela Tackefman, the symposium editor, have done wonderful work. Nick Coots, who is right here, is the program director of the Florsheim Center and is largely responsible for all of this coming off so well. And then the real kind of brains behind the operation, the person who has made this happen and who I'm about to hand the microphone over to, is Deborah Pearlstein, who's been on our faculty since 2011, who previously worked at Human Rights First, a sort of leading figure and expert in international human rights, national security, counter-terrorism, and it has been a pleasure to have her on our faculty, and it is a pleasure now to pass the microphone over to her. So, Deborah, welcome everybody.
Thank you. And let me just echo the thanks, especially to the Florsheim Center for sponsoring our events today, and to the Cardozo Law Review for sponsoring the event this evening and tomorrow. I'm delighted to see familiar faces in the audience and unfamiliar as well. We have a set of extraordinary panelists with us. It feels a little bit ridiculous to be called a leading person in human rights in this field, given who's on the panel. I want to make this as much of a discussion as we can as possible among us, and then we'll be sure to have time for audience questions as well. Let me start by giving just brief introductions, because if I spent too much time, I could literally go on for about a half an hour about each of them. So I'll go from this side. This is Mary DeRosa, who is now at Georgetown Law School. She was, until recently, I think, 2011, right? Deputy Assistant to the President and the Chief Legal Counsel at the National Security Council at the White House, so the Chief Legal Advisor at the White House on national security matters. This is John Bellinger, who I think at one point also held that job, who is now at Arnold and Porter, and maybe more relevant, both also relevant for this discussion, was the State Department legal advisor from, let's see, I have the dates right, 2005 to 2009, and I'm delighted to have them both here. On this side, we have Ali Soufan, who is now in consulting work, but for a long time was an FBI agent, a supervisory agent for the FBI. You may know him most from his truly extraordinary book called Black Banners, which was about the sort of origin and evolution of the Al-Qaeda, the attacks of 9/11, and the response that followed to some extent. He was a lead investigator on the attacks on the East African embassy bombings in the 1990s, the attacks on the U.S. Cole, and also centrally involved in our investigations in response to the attacks of 9/11. So I'm just thrilled to have you here with us as well. And over on this side is General David Barno, who, among his extraordinary list of decorations, was the commanding general in charge in Afghanistan, of U.S. forces in Afghanistan from 2003 to 2005. So thank you all for being here. I'm thrilled to have you. And I actually, given that I've just given such brief introductions, which don't do you justice at all, and given that we have a number of students in the audience, I want to start by asking if you can each tell us, sort of for public consumption terms, what your day jobs were. What did you do? Pick your most relevant position and tell us, what you did as lawyer for the National Security Council.
Okay. Well, the lawyer for the National Security Council, it's a very small office. There's a legal advisor, and during my time there, we got up to 5 lawyers in the office. I think, John, you were there were maybe 4. Started at 2. So it's a very small office, and what the job is really to do the legal work for all of the issues, all of the national security issues that are coming to the National Security Council and coming to the President. Obviously, those 5 lawyers can't be the world's experts on everything that comes to the NSC. So I'd say the 2 main jobs of the National Security Council legal advisor are to convene and work with the lawyers from around the government, the national security lawyers. So that would be General Counsel of the Department of Defense and the legal advisor to the chairman, the General Counsel or the State Department legal advisor, the General Counsel of CIA, the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel, et cetera. Work with all of these people and people from their offices to identify the issues that are coming up to the President or to the National Security Council. Go out and work with all the people who know the answers, come to legal positions, and then the second part of the job of a legal advisor is to be basically sitting in the meetings of all the principals committee meetings, which is the meetings of the secretary level people, the deputies committee meetings, and often meetings with the President, and convey the legal advice that you've just developed with the help of everybody in the government. So that is a very, those are the 2 major functions, are very short. These are really long days, I have to say.
Leave it. Thank you, John.
Thanks. It's nice to be back here, Cardozo. Let me first say, just for all of you all who have gotten to know Deborah, I've known Deborah for about a decade now and have visited her in other law schools where she's been, and you all really are extremely fortunate to have grabbed her here. And as you can tell from the day's conference, some of which you haven't seen, she's just done a fantastic job. And then a word about Mary. What Mary didn't say, Miss Mary was both my predecessor and my successor.
Yeah,
so right. I was the...
I had the same job, all close to the same job.
There's a story here, which I'll tell very briefly. I was the NSC legal advisor in the job Mary had from 2001 to 2005. Then I ran Secretary Rice's confirmation process and was myself confirmed as the legal advisor and the general counsel of the State Department for the 2nd term, so I spent all 8 years in the Bush administration. Mary had been the NSC legal advisor in the Clinton administration, and so the first person I called when I got this job was I called Mary and said, how do I do this job? As Mary said, this is an extremely difficult job to do, particularly in wartime. What Mary didn't do, though, was when she was asked by the Obama administration to come back to do the same job, she didn't call me up to say, should I do this again? Yeah, because I would have said no.
Nobody in their right mind would do it again.
Anyway, Mary, other than to say I was in the Situation Room on 9/11, as it changed all of our lives, it certainly changed my life as a lawyer, and I spent the next 7.5 years essentially as a wartime lawyer, having to become a leading expert on the Geneva Conventions and the use of force and other things. When I did move to the State Department Legal Advisor's Office, the General Counsel of the State Department is a very large office. There are 180 lawyers. The legal advisor is the leading international lawyer for the U.S. government, and it really is a wonderful job, and particularly if you have a good relationship with your Secretary of State, as I did with Condoleezza Rice, as Harold Koh and this administration did with Hillary Clinton. You deal with fascinating issues of international law. That doesn't mean these are not extremely difficult, as we have been seeing recently, having to deal with Syria and Libya and terrorism. Every issue, really, that you see these days in the New York Times or elsewhere that is international has got an international law component, and often the legal advisor is right at the center of it. Do we cut off aid to Egypt? Issue for the legal advisor as to whether it's required to be cut off. Can we use force in Syria or Libya? Issue for the legal advisor. Do we negotiate a UN Security Council resolution and what's in it with respect to Syria? Issue for the legal advisor. Do we negotiate some new treaty? An issue for the legal advisor. So every international issue, interpretation of treaties, negotiation of treaties, the ratification of treaties through the Senate, all issues for lawyers in the legal advisor's office. One thing that has changed a bit in the last, I would say, 8 years, both for me and then for Harold Coe, is that we've had to become a bit more of a public spokesman for the international legal positions of the U.S. government. In the old days, while always a fascinating job being the legal advisor, it was a little bit more behind the scenes. I mean, you were out negotiating treaties, out arguing before the International Court of Justice. But now, so many countries in the world are asking questions about the U.S. position on drones or the U.S. position on Syria that it can be difficult for our rank-and-file diplomats to explain these legal positions. And so it can fall to the legal advisor himself, or we hope one day there will be a woman as the legal advisor, that will fall to the legal advisor to be the principal spokesman on international law issues for the U.S. government.
Well, you know, you met the smart guys who keep us out of trouble. I was an FBI agent, and I was assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York. And I get stuck with working Osama bin Laden early on. So in 1998, when the East Africa Embassy bombing happened, New York at the time was the Office of Origin. It's you know, FBI terminology, which means anything that Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda network do anywhere around the world, New York is responsible of the investigation. So our first direct involvement with Al-Qaeda was after August 7, 1998, after the East Africa Embassy bombing. We started putting the whole network of the organization together. And between the East Africa Embassy bombing and the call, there was a lot of disruptions that took place. A lot of people don't know about, from the Millennium Operation to the Albania operation, to Italy, to Operation Challenge in the UK, and so forth. Later on, we were able to successfully disrupt many terrorist plots, arrest many terrorists, and sometimes, in many instances, prosecute them, and in many other instances, send them back to their countries for prosecution. 9/11 definitely changed all our lives. You know, in 9/11, when it happened, I was in Yemen, and we heard about it on television. We were evacuating the country to come back to the U.S., and I was tasked to stay in the country because there's something that we were working on the USS Cole that were connected directly to 9/11. So we ended up being the team that generated the intelligence that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were directly involved in 9/11, and that was information that was obtained through our investigation in Yemen in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. After that, I became a supervisor, which means very, very boring job. What I used to love, running around the world, trying to catch bad guys, now my guys do, and I sit, you know, live through them in the office and back in my desk in the office in New York. But it was very interesting times, and you know, and you know, I'm glad that I had to experience all these kind of things, to include working in Guantanamo early on in 2002, working in Afghanistan, and working in other locations. It's a great job. I think I'm very biased towards the FBI, as you will probably see throughout the event here. But I advise a lot of you guys who would like to have a world of adventure and a life of adventure to apply for the FBI or the CIA or any of the intelligence agencies. You can use your talents, and the country can use you too.
Maybe three quick vignettes. I spent 30 years in the Army, a lot of my early days in Army Ranger battalions, which have played a pretty big role in the counter-terrorist war over the last 10 years. After the invasion of Panama, I parachuted in as the ops officer of my Ranger battalion. Came back. My 7-year-old son came back up to me and said, "Dad, what did you do? Did you kill anybody?" And I said, "No, I didn't kill anybody." He goes, "Well, what did you do?" I said, "Well, mostly I just talked on the radio." And he screwed his face off and said, "Dad, you never do anything." And so I kind of feel like that a little bit here tonight, talking about some of the things that I've done over the last few years. Second vignette, I was the deputy ops officer for U.S. Pacific Command as a one-star back in '99 when the Cole attack took place. And I remember having a team come out from the Pentagon to interview us on how we did force protection in the Pacific with all of those fleet assets, all those ships out there. And at the end of that interview, I remember telling the interviewer, we are never going to be able to succeed in this battle unless we have an offensive component to our strategy. We don't have one today. All we have is defense. And then about a year later, we suddenly got an offensive strategy after the 9/11 attack. So about 2 years after 9/11, I was posted out to Afghanistan as the overall commander of U.S. forces there in October of 2003. The Iraq War had taken place about 6 months earlier, its initial stages, and Afghanistan was very much what the military would call an economy of force theater, which means end of the line, end of the shoestring. And so we had about 14,000 troops when I first got there, about 21,000 when I left about 19 months later. And my primary mission there as the overall commander was initially to build a headquarters in Kabul to oversee the day-to-day tactical operations, which are down the road to peace at Bagram Air Base, and really transition from a strategy focused only on counterterrorism to a little bit broader strategy on counterinsurgency. And as part of that, my day-to-day responsibilities involved ensuring what I knew that the military was moving in the right direction, but also overwatching the special operations component of that fight to include some of our more surgical elements and taking a look at how they were doing their business, making adjustments to that, withholding permissions on certain things, and as I told a couple of folks earlier tonight, stopping some attack operations, particularly some precision air attack operations that were killing a lot of civilians and weren't really getting the job done. So had a lot of firsthand experience in understanding the limitations of our technology, the limitations and the availability of doing a lot of things with a lot of authorities, but not necessarily always choosing the right thing to do with the right capabilities. So that was a pretty interesting experience for me. I've got a little bit more on the family side I'll share when we get into other parts of this in terms of 2 sons that I have out there in uniform as well, and until recently a daughter-in-law. So, and they fit very much into this fight because they've served out there in the theater as well.
Thank you, tremendous. So part of the impetus, not the only impetus, but it's as good a place to start as any for this event, and the title, Law at the End of War, ? Was a speech President Obama gave in May of this year. And he described in that speech, which was a remarkable address, I think, in many ways, the changing nature of the threat that we face from terrorism sort of worldwide, noting, as he has on many occasions, that sort of major conflicts in Iraq was over, the conflict in Afghanistan, the major operations in Afghanistan were moving toward an end, and we are scheduled to leave, our combat troops scheduled to leave Afghanistan in 2014, and arguing that core al-Qaeda, the al-Qaeda that attacked us on 9/11, is well on a path to defeat. As he put it, our systematic effort to dismantle terrorist organizations must continue, but this war, like all wars, must end. That's what history advises. That's what our democracy demands. What do you think the president meant by that? And how is the threat changing? Do you agree with the president's assessment? Where are we? General Barnett, let me start with you. And then.
I think that's an aspirational goal, and I agree in principle with what the president is suggesting. But this goes back to my earlier comment about talking a bit about my family, and I shared this earlier today. My youngest son's an Army Special Operations helicopter pilot. He's done a year full up in Afghanistan and then done several shorter deployments there and elsewhere. And I saw him about 10 days ago. And one of the things I shared with him before coming to this event was, your war is never going to be over. The units that you're in and the units you support are going to be fighting forever in this conflict because they're focused on al-Qaeda and they're focused on the terrorist threat around the world. That flies in the face, of course, of what President Obama said in his remarks at National Defense University earlier this year. And so as I look at this, and again, from inside my family where I've got sons, daughters-in-law, friends of theirs that are very much involved in this fight and have been involved in it for the last decade. There are the regular Army and the Marine Corps and the Navy and the Air Force are going to come back home here soon, if they haven't already, and go back into something that resembles peacetime training and peacetime pursuits. If you're in the special operations part of the military, though, in my view, and this is the Rangers, the SEALs, the Special Ops Aviators, some of the Delta Force folks, some of the other operators out there, their war is going to continue, and it's going to be a war in the shadows. It's going to be a war that's enabled by a lot of these authorities that exist today that are not going to go away, and it's going to recede from the front page of the newspapers in a lot of ways, but it's not going to end. So as much as I admire the President for getting out and making that commitment, and I agree absolutely the United States as a nation and even as a military can't remain on a perpetual wartime footing, there is going to be a segment of that force that I certainly have ties to that is going to stay at war for as long as I can imagine because of the nature of the world we're in.
I think I agree with the general, and I think it has a lot to do with the definitions. I mean, how do you define war? The traditional war, our troops in Iraq, our troops in Afghanistan, yes, this is ending. But I think we have an asymmetrical global conflict, and that's going to continue. Al-Qaeda today is not only in Pakistan. Al-Qaeda today is not only in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda, affiliates, if you want to call it, entities that operates under Al-Qaeda's banner, that take instructions, at least ideological instructions, and sometimes tactical instructions from Al-Qaeda Central, from Ayman Zawahiri. You can find them now in Nigeria, you can find them in Mali, you can find them in Libya, in Syria, in the Arabian Peninsula with Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula in south of Yemen. So actually you can make an argument that the threat is actually spreading. We used to have only safe havens in Afghanistan. Now we have safe havens in Yemen. We have safe havens in northern Syria, in Iraq. We have safe havens in so many different areas around the world. The French are involved in Mali. They were involved in Mali fighting Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb and its affiliates. The Nigerians are, and the people, the government of Cameroon and the government of Chad is involved in combating Boko Haram in West Africa, Al-Shabaab. Even though the African Union were able to diminish their capabilities, able to destroy their presence in Mogadishu and Kismayo, the organization appears to basically revert back to the traditional modus operandi of terrorist actions, especially with their recent attacks in Mali. So actually you can make a point that Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, the ideology of Al-Qaeda, let's say, or the narrative of Al-Qaeda is spreading around. And just the operations on October 5th, both in Somalia and Libya, is, I think, indication of how the future is going to be. I 100% agree with the general. I think the asymmetrical conflict will continue for many, many years to come. The war footing, having troops on the ground in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq, that's probably something of the past.
So let me ask the lawyers. Obama noted in that same address the need to engage Congress to determine how we can continue to fight terrorism without keeping America on a perpetual wartime footing. In particular, he talked about the need to reconsider or potentially reconsider this major piece of post-September 11th legislation that's still on the books, the authorization for use of military force, that has been the statutory basis for a lot of what one might describe as war-type powers, right? Detention, targeting, certainly in Afghanistan, but beyond as well, that the United States has engaged in. Do you think he meant we can effectively fight terrorism without the AUMF or an AUMF-like authority on the books? Do you think that's possible? What was your reaction as opposed to the President's speech? John?
Well, so you've organized this perfectly because you've given the context from the people who are actually out there on the front lines and then gone to us lawyers. And since we're here in a law school, I think this is an opportunity. So I was actually as I said, I was in the Situation Room on 9/11, and then we had a scramble to set up the necessary legal authorities to do the things that we needed to do to respond. And one of the first things that we did was to seek congressional authorization, essentially, to go to war. And what it was this authorization to use military force, which was an extremely short statute, which was signed by the President, I think, on September 18th or so, 2001. It's only about 55 words long, and it just simply authorizes the President to use all appropriate force against those who committed, planned, or carried out 9/11 or harbored those who did, the individuals, organizations, or nations who did that. And for the last 12 years, almost all of our counterterrorism authorities, whether it's detention, drones, use of force, have all hung on those 12 words. And there's been a lot of debate about whether that ought to be revised. So although there was a lot that I agreed with in the president's speech, and there were also some things that I thought were perplexing, one of the most perplexing things, as you alluded to, Deborah, was this reference in the president's speech that he wanted to work with Congress to revise. That made sense because 12 years later the AUMF hasn't been revised, but our conflict with terrorists has certainly changed. But ultimately to repeal the authorization to use military force. So the president said he wanted to repeal his own authorization given to him by Congress to use military force, upon which almost all of our counterterrorism operations by the military are carried out. To a certain extent, he was responding, I think, and maybe I'm trying to get too much in the president's head, by a real war weariness amongst the American people, and particularly, I think, amongst some in the president's base who really would just like to move beyond all of this. If you didn't see it, about a month before the president's speech, there was a editorial in the New York Times called "Repeal the Military Force Law," and I'm not going to align the president with the New York Times Ed Board, but I have to say, I thought that was, the New York Times Ed Board says a lot of strange things. I thought that was the strangest I have ever seen, because it seemed to be saying, and I got a whiff of this in the president's speech, is, well, if we ask Congress to repeal the legislative authority to carry out these wartime operations, then we can just fold up shop and go home and we won't have to do these things anymore. That it reminds me a little bit when my children were young and they would put their hands over their eyes and say, "You're not there." And the problem is that, as you heard the general say, and Ali say as well from his perspective, is the terrorist threat has not gone away. I very much share the president's war weariness, and I absolutely would not align myself with those who say, every person who we capture ought to be sent to Guantanamo. This only ought to be done through a military capacity. But the fact is, we are continuing to carry out now and will carry out for, I think, the foreseeable future, as you heard the general said, military operations to protect ourselves, whether it's through drone strikes, use of special operations forces, or other things. So we have to have legal authority to do that. Here's my point. We have to have legal authority to do that. There are two choices. You can either have congressional authorization to do it, or the president can rely only on his inherent constitutional powers. We can't just wish the threat away and say, if we repeal the authorization, then maybe we won't have to use force. It doesn't work that way. If the president unilaterally renounces his right to use force, the terrorists are not going to wrap up shop and go home. And so this was the part, and I'll stop in a moment, that was most perplexing to me, is for a president who has said that he wants generally to rely on congressional grants of authority, why would he want to repeal his own grant of authority and to instead rely only on constitutional powers? We want the war to end, but we also want, to the extent that we're using our military force around the world, we want that to be authorized by Congress. So I did find that it seemed to be sort of a bone thrown to those who wish this war would end, which includes me, but you can't just repeal the authorization and then hope that we won't have to use our military anymore. So I found that really perplexing.
Perhaps not surprisingly, I have a far more positive view of the president's speech, and I didn't feel perplexed at all. I will say I think he was doing two things, and both were pretty significant. One was that he was setting up and articulating a long-term vision, a longer-term vision of a war that would end, and by a war that would end, meaning the military, the military element, for the most part of this conflict would end. And I think yes, it was a long-term notion, but I think it was a very significant thing for a president to do, and a shift in sort of the post 9/11 conversation or rhetoric on the part of political leaders, which is, not surprisingly, completely understandably, what you have heard since 9/11 from political leaders of all stripes on all sides is sort of, the threat is great. We've got to fight. We have to keep on going until every last terrorist is dead, and this sort of thing. I mean, we're sort of in a world, and I think remain in a world where law enforcement became sort of an epithet, sort of a bad word. The idea of using law enforcement or a bad phrase, the idea of using law enforcement to address some of the things. So into this conversation, which really, this sort of rhetoric, which really hadn't changed much. The president is saying it's going to have to end. We are not, as a country, we shouldn't be on a perpetual war footing, and we should be looking toward a time when the war will end, and that we will address. And very significantly, he said, he didn't say, the war will end when every terrorist is dead. He said terrorism to some degree will remain, but it will be a risk that is at a level that we can deal with through other tools. So that is his, sort of long-term vision, and I think the fact that he was laying out that vision is significant and important. He then also had a shorter, immediate to midterm vision, which was, and he set out a framework for the way operations would be handled not in the Afghanistan theater. So how we would carry out these operations and an aggressive fight against Al Qaeda, continue to have a war, be at war with Al Qaeda, and carry on military and other operations aggressively, but outside of the Afghanistan theater, he actually set out a series of constraints, policy constraints that he and his administration were going to apply, and that included extraordinary efforts to protect civilians from collateral damage beyond what is legally required in the law of armed conflict. Operations, military strikes would happen only where there is a continuing and imminent threat, again, which is a standard that is more restrictive than what would be permitted under an armed conflict legal standard. Preference for capture over killing of combatants, preference for the use of the U.S. civilian justice system, and a preference for using military operations rather than covert, largely because there's able to be more transparency with military operations. So there is this framework that imposes some policy constraints on how you can carry out these operations, and that was his medium. He thinks for now that's where we need to be. My reading I can't get, I'm not in the head of the president any more than John is, but my reading of the discussion of the AUMF was that in the longer term, when that there will be a world without an AUMF when there is a world without war, and I don't think he was thinking of it in quite as far out as maybe some of the other panelists are. But in the shorter term, I don't believe that he was saying we should get rid of the.
Can I respond just briefly on that? And I'll be brief on that, because I actually agree with about 90% of the things that Mary said. I mean, the thing is, when we've been in these national security jobs, I think there's actually very little partisan differences amongst us because we've sat in these jobs and they're just sort of very hard to do. And actually, much of the substance of the president's speech, including the limits that were placed on drones and other things, I thought reflected a lot of extraordinarily good work by Mary and her successor and others, and was really good work. So I'm really just sort of focused in particular on this AUMF, which I felt we are going to be using military force. Hopefully it will dwindle down. I'm absolutely in favor of using the criminal justice system. I'm not a sort of a binary person the way some are who say, well, we're only at war, we can't use the criminal justice system. Absolutely we should use it as much as we can. But the fact is, we are going to be having to use military force against terror groups around the world for quite a long period of time. And there's got to be a legal basis for it. And President Obama himself had said that he didn't want to be a president only relying on constitutional powers. That does not have the full imprimatur of the American people. So if you take as the premise, and maybe the fact is that the premise is being fought, that we're going to have to be using the military force for a long period of time, it seems to me that there ought to be congressional authorization for it, and that we can't just stop the use of military force by taking away the congressional authorization. Now, Mary has, and actually I really am interested in this because I have been so perplexed that I just couldn't really understand it. And I think if what Mary's saying is that, well, this is really a long-term aspiration, and I'm sort of looking over the horizon to the day that I hope that we can repeal this altogether, I guess I do understand that, but why does the president even say that he wants to sort of repeal his own authorization to use force when for the foreseeable future it's going to be necessary for him to do so? Isn't it better to say, I want to work with Congress on this?
So I want to, it raises about three different questions in my mind, which is the professional hazard. But let me start with a two-part question that sort of goes in the law and policy direction. So when one talks about uses of force and whether those uses of force are military force or capture operations or even law enforcement operations overseas of different kinds, it's not just domestic legal authorization we need to worry about in principle. We have international legal obligations as well, treaty obligations that the U.S. has signed and ratified, and customary international law. My short question is, how much does that matter in this context, right? You've been effectively in the front legal lines of this. How much do those international legal constraints matter? And then to put a little more sort of meat on that question, as you think about uses of force, the sort of primary scheme of international law we talk about, or the options, one model is the kind of armed conflict model, which is well recognizable. You know, the U.S. invades Afghanistan. We sort of know what that looks like in terms of legal constraints. There is a second model, which is a nation acting in self-defense. And sometimes certainly that's permissible, and what the parameters of that sometimes are is much the subject of debate. But we have on the table now two great and very recent examples of, in effect, uses of force overseas, just from the last 2 weeks. We have the capture of a Libby in Libya, where, as far as I can tell from public reports, we have involved on the ground at least FBI, CIA, Libyan assets, possibly at some level military assets as well. Libby arrives in New York, I guess, this weekend, and will be arraigned here in the Southern District of New York on Tuesday. So stay tuned. And at the same time, we have really essentially the same day the operation in Somalia. U.S. Special Forces, I think, right, go into Somalia and attempt capture. Ultimately, the capture operation is unsuccessful. In part, it appears because of concerns of civilian deaths. Are those operations lawful under international law? Does it matter? And are they wise uses of force? Does this help us? Does this move us forward? You can start with the law side if you want. Good luck.
First, well, your first question was how important is the international law? I mean, I would say extremely important. And at least in my experience, we spent just about as much time worrying about and thinking about and analyzing the international legal position as we did domestic. I think that, and I'd say it's very important. The U.S. position on some international legal issues is not the same, and not, in some particular respect, is not widely accepted internationally. Nonetheless, it is the way you affect international law. The way you change international law is through state practice, and we have an articulation of state practice and articulation of views. I think the U.S. has taken credible positions on a lot of international legal issues that are not widely accepted, but are maybe growing in acceptance. Some might dispute that. I think I don't know how much of the specifics you want me to get into, but I think that as far as I can tell from the outside and reading the news stories, that the operations in the past 2 weeks were consistent with international law. The one issue is to what extent there was consent of the countries we entered, and that's a factual issue. And I think from reports that I'm reading, my sense is that we had consent.
So maybe you can say just a word about why consent matters, what that comes from.
Well, because when you are violating the sovereignty, if you enter another country without their consent, you are violating the sovereignty, which is a violation of international law. There are some ways there's an analysis that under some circumstances you can do that if there is a threat in that country that the country is unwilling or unable to address, that gives you under international law the right to go in. But the best way is to get the consent of the country. Therefore, you're not violating their sovereignty. And from the reports, it appears that we did that.
So the Libyan government publicly says no,
right.
but
Yeah,
off the record, administration
exactly.
officials say yes, we had consent. Right. So okay, John.
So on that, I agree with 100% of what Mary said, and I almost have nothing to add other than to, I guess, try to leave sort of two points. I mean, one, in every use of force that the U.S. government makes, certainly in my 8 years in the Bush administration and from what I've seen in the 4 years of the Obama administration, every use of force is analyzed by U.S. lawyers. One, is it legal under U.S. law? So is there either a constitutional basis for it, or has Congress passed a statute? And we have both constitutional power and the AUMF. And then is it legal under international law? And the U.S. wants to act consistent with international law. And so we make every effort to show that our use of force in another country is either not an infringement of their sovereignty because they've consented, because we're acting in self-defense, or because we're acting in self-defense and the country is unwilling or unable to do something about a threat. Unfortunately, as Mary has said, throughout the last 12 years, through both administrations, the U.S. has been engaged in various controversial uses of force, whether it's detention under the laws of war, drone strikes, special forces operations like the raid against bin Laden or these most recent. And other countries do not agree in a lot of cases that our uses of force are legal. And this goes back to one of the very first things I said of why it now falls to the legal advisor at the State Department to engage other countries in dialogue to say, look, this is our legal rationale. This is why we think what we're doing is legal under international law. Tell me your views. We maybe can talk about drones later, but that's where there is a huge divide. You know, both the Bush and particularly the Obama administrations have felt that the use of drones is legal under international law. Virtually no other country in the world believes that is right. So unfortunately, a lot of our counterterrorism operations through both administrations, where lawyers have felt that we are legally justified under international law, other countries don't agree with this. As Mary said, we've been engaging in things that then become state practice, and we try to explain to other countries why we think it actually fits into accepted norms of international law. But it's definitely an ongoing conversation.
Well, let me ask on this side, to what extent does international law play into your thinking, if at all, about how you did your jobs when you were in the field? And as to these particular operations, what was your reaction to them strategically, tactically, legally, if you want to comment? Is this a kind of model of uses of force going forward you think we can expect to see more of? Does it make sense, et cetera?
Yeah, maybe to start on that. Everything you're doing in the military and in a combat theater is going to be embedded in a framework of international law. And every commander has a lawyer or a stable of lawyers assigned to him or her to continually give updates and advice, interpret situations as they come in, but be an advisor. The commander ultimately is the decider on these things, and can choose to accept or reject that advice and take the risks that come with that. So all of these decisions on use of force broadly are going to come down from the White House to the Pentagon and on down through the military, and things are going to be, before any operation, very carefully nested inside of international and domestic law, and the execution orders for that operation will represent the details of those facts to you, so you'll have that. On the operation we've been talking about here over the last 2 weeks, I think two thoughts now. One is that these may be a very good indicator, a good reflection of that speech the President gave back in May, indicating in real terms now a preference to try and capture individuals as opposed to simply kill them. In both cases, these individuals probably could have been killed, perhaps without exposing any Americans to risk, but the decision was made, there's higher value, and there may be more utility in capturing them, and it might be able to be done in ways that didn't involve risks to civilians on the ground that perhaps a drone strike or something similar might have. So in the case of I only know what I've read in the newspaper about this, but in the case of the Libya operation, appears that it was an American Special Forces unit accompanied probably by some American law enforcement who were able to snatch this individual without any shots being fired and transport him presumably to a U.S. ship, and he's now been transported back here for trial, which is, again, pretty strong support for the idea of the value of not only capturing individuals but using the legal system to prosecute them for crimes that we suspect them. In the case of the Somalia operation, very interesting, different situation there where ostensibly one of our naval special warfare units came ashore pre-dawn hours, got in a very big fight, and the commander decided, rather than calling an airstrike, which apparently had the latitude to do, to back off, avoid the civilian casualties because the enemy forces were embedded with a large number of civilians, and simply abort the mission and extract, which, again, pretty interesting decision on his part. I think the right decision from what I've seen of it so far, but reflects this new idea that we're going to put a significant weight on trying to capture people. We're also going to avoid civilian casualties unless absolutely necessary. So that was a very conservative move, and given all the preparation that went into that raid. And I think that reflects quite a bit that was in the President's speech earlier this year.
I think when it comes to international law, I come from the agency that, to use the analogy of your colleague, live totally in hell. So international law, federal law, state law, every law,
Yes.
the Attorney General guidelines, everything. So definitely it has to be within the constitutional boundaries and within the legal jurisdictions set by the OJ and by the United States. But I agree with Mary, I cannot see the operation happening without a consent from the Libyan authorities. And I think that operation is a very good operation. It's exceptional. This individual was involved in the casing of the embassy in Nairobi in 1993, 1994, one of the early members of Al-Qaeda. This is the person that actually we discovered at his house the very famous Manchester Manual. This is a person who was in the inner circle of bin Laden in Sudan when bin Laden was in Sudan, and after he was let go in 2000 in Manchester, he escaped back and joined bin Laden. So I think this is a great operation. This is a great message that you can hide, but you can run, but you cannot hide. And eventually, if you have American blood in your hand, we're going to get you. That's a huge narrative. And I look at the operation in Somalia. I'm fascinated by that operation. It came in the immediate aftermath of the operation in the Westgate Mall in Nairobi. That individual allegedly was involved in doing recruitment for that specific operation, and it came around the anniversary of Black Hawk Down. And with Black Hawk Down, everybody around the world was saying, you know what, the Americans now are scared. They will never dare to come to Somalia. They will never dare to go to a hostile environment and catch their guy. They learned their lesson from Somalia. And
Can you just remind us what Black Hawk Down is?
Well, Black Hawk Down is when a bunch of troops back in, I believe, 1993, went to arrest Ahmed Aidid, who's a Somali warlord, same, right? Warlord. And I think they were trapped by, we now believe, Al-Qaeda. And helicopter was shot down and they dragged American soldiers' bodies on the ground and so forth. And it created a lot of, at least internationally, and Al-Qaeda and bin Laden spoke of Black Hawk Down so much. He said the Americans are so scared. Look how they ran away from Somalia. Look how they will never do anything now after the operation in Somalia. So at the anniversary of that operation, we went to Somalia to get one of the individuals who was involved in the operation in Nairobi. So the backdrop of this operation, regardless if we're able to get the guy or not, is extremely significant in the narrative against fighting Al-Qaeda and their affiliates. So I agree with the general. I think it was a good move for the SEALs to move back, but I think they were under total control the whole time. It was amazing the amount of firepower that they were under, but they were comfortable the whole time. Not even one person was injured from the SEALs, so it tells you that they were in total control. The one in Libya with Anas al-Libi, it was, from what we know now, a joint task force. And this is basically a perfect example how now the president is moving towards moving all the tools available in the toolbox. They include military, intelligence, law enforcement. The Libya thing shows that how all of them are working together to get an individual with American blood on his hand that has been indicted in 2000 in the Southern District in New York and brought him back to the United States. So I think from this perspective, you're dealing with the bad guys in the only language they understand, and I think within the framework of our laws and values, which I believe is the strongest arsenal we have in our weapons against Al-Qaeda.
So I want to back up in a minute and come back to the broader question of war and what does it mean if this is the model? How should we think about that? But as long as we're on this case and as long as we have you with us, so one of the criticisms, not so much of this case, al-Libi was held on this ship for what appears to now have been, a week or a bit less, interrogated by U.S. officials without having been given Miranda warnings, without access to counsel, et cetera, before being brought here when it appears the plan will be he will be, given his Miranda warnings, re-questioned by the FBI, a team that has not had contact with the intelligence interrogation. Concerns about that, both from a legal point of view, a human rights point of view, et cetera. And so for you, I guess, is that a necessary model? Is that the right model? How much are we gaining from the week in which we ask him questions without a lawyer versus just bringing him back here and prosecuting him and giving him a lawyer in the first instance? Does it matter one way or another? Does it concern you?
Well, I don't know much about that specific case, but so what? I mean, if there is an intelligence-based interrogation that needs to take place in order to generate intelligence that probably does not mean much to the individuals who are involved in the criminal case, I'm fine with that. I mean, it's not like you're taking them and putting him like 10 years for undisclosed location and you don't know what he's going under. I mean, this is legal. That has been proven legal before. The Warsami case, he was, I think, on a ship for about 40 days, I believe, before he was brought to the United States. And the case against him was extremely legal, and he pled guilty in so many different cases where we have an intelligence team talk to the individual before he was read his Miranda rights. The Times Square bombing here in New York, the underwear bomber in Detroit. So I think I'm fine with that. And the Hague team has a role, and they are playing that role, and the criminal guys have a role, and they will play the role. And again, this is a different type of a threat. We need to use all tools available to us in the toolbox. And if some people will be more comfortable in having an intelligence-based interrogation and the regular interrogation, that's fine.
So if this is the model going forward, or if this is a model going forward, where you have maybe a military capture, you have an intelligence interrogation under the authority of the AUMF for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, followed by a criminal prosecution by the FBI, is this war? Does it matter what we call it? Stepping sort of way back, politically, socially, culturally, legally, right? Does it make a difference whether or not we think of ourselves as at war? Is the fact that, so there's no major battlefield other than everywhere, but it's not like Iraq or Afghanistan. Does change the way we understand these authorities, what we ourselves are doing in the world, if we say, you know, the war part has ended, now it's a new model? Does it change anything? Anyone? Tough one. John, yeah.
I mean, I guess I would say, although I think this particular operation is novel and I would support it, and I imagine if I were in Mary's position as NSC legal advisor, I would say this is a reasonable balance, as we did in the Warsami case. Capture the person with the military, hold them under the laws of war for a period of time while they're questioned without a lawyer, then turn them into the criminal justice system. What it does is it balances the advantages of both systems, but it is controversial. And so you know, this is still very novel. It's certainly better than holding someone for a long period of time, but this is not a sort of an easy, this is uncharted waters. So to channel my inner Deborah Pearlstein here, you know, the human rights, I mean, I imagine human rights groups are not going to be very happy about the idea of someone being snatched by the military, held for any period of time under the laws of war without a lawyer, then ultimately put into the criminal justice system. I mean, what this shows, though, is it does show you know, the administration is trying desperately to balance the tools that they have of when you have terrorists who are not in our country and who are outside our jurisdiction, and where we can grab them with the military and then turn them over into the criminal justice system. But you know, we've had these two cases. The first one did work out all right because he pled guilty and essentially didn't challenge this snatch and detention. We don't know what al-Libby's going to do. So I don't know whether this model is going to work out as a model or not. Connecting it, though, then finally with the AUMF, well, at least right now there is congressional authorization. If there's no congressional authorization for use of force, then if the future model is, well, the president, based on his constitutional authority alone, goes and snatches people around the world with the military, holds them incommunicado for any period of time, whether it's 2 days to 60 days, and then turns them over to the criminal justice system, I can imagine that being controversial. So we're still working our way through this, and I remain concerned about withdrawing legislative authority. The legislative authority of the elected representatives of the American people who are passing laws that authorize this. Otherwise, unless we're just going to say there are no military operations, you're relying on the president's constitutional power alone.
I mean, I think that's, I mean, I think I actually agree with most of what John said, although I don't, I mean, I think that this activity, this interrogation on a ship or wherever under the laws of war before turning someone over to the criminal justice system is a military, you know, it is an operation, it is an activity that requires, based on the law of armed conflict, and that the AUMF is important. I mean, is it possible legally to do it without an AUMF? I'm not sure. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out, but I think far better to be done, to have the authority of the AUMF to do it. And I think that's the view of the administration, as far as I can tell. That I don't think there is any immediate push on the part of the administration to get rid of the AUMF. I haven't detected it in any event. And as long as I think you need to do this kind of operation, then you probably want to have an AUMF. So I guess I'll stop there. I had some other point, but I forget what it was.
Well, the broader question of, you know, we've got a lot of legal terms, the AUMF and statutory authorities and constitutional authorities, but the broader question is, you know, the president in his speech seemed to be trying to make, right, a broader legal points, but also a much broader rhetorical point and historical point, which is at some point we have to stop thinking about what we're doing as war, almost no matter what we call it, and our ongoing counterterrorism efforts will involve continuing uses of force, but let's not think of it, I suppose, as war. Does that make any difference? Does it matter? What, if anything, happens when you use the word war politically, socially, historically?
Just briefly, I think on the legal side, we've charted a lot of the territory there and what it means, and we've been looking at war through the lens of law today, certainly. And I think, as we talked about earlier today, there are a lot of other signals in moving away from a war footing in terms of what's the Pentagon's funding going to look like, what's the principal focus of the military over the next few years, to what extent are we on a wartime footing with contractors and civilians and military and all the the tremendous surge we saw of that after 9/11, which I think rightfully now is being dialed back, and we're trying to move to a successor to this very large state of military operations and war that we've been in for 12 years. I think that's all right. The only concern I would have is that I don't want to see us get to a point where our military folks that are still in this conflict, war, whatever we choose to call it, don't have their actions seen for what they are, which is combat activities. I mean, the SEALs that went ashore in Somalia last week were not doing a SWAT team raid in South Los Angeles. And I was in the 90s, I can recall being very uncomfortable with the directions that we were moving in as we saw the military intersect with law enforcement. I think we were too far on the law enforcement side of counterterrorism there. I think we paid, to some degree, a price for that. I don't think we want to be on the opposite end of that now, but I also want to make sure that our military units that are still doing this, and again, I believe special operators are going to be doing this for a long, long time. I don't want them to be viewed as simply ancillaries to our law enforcement activities, because they're going to be risking their lives. We're going to take casualties. People are going to get killed. They're going to have to make very tough decisions under fire. That's my definition of combat. I want to be careful we don't get too far away from that in our thinking.
No, I agree, and I think name it what you want to name it, or call it what you want to call it, war, conflict, whatever. I mean, we have a lot of people around the world, a lot of groups around the world, in many different regions of the world, declared war on the United States in so many ways, and they want to hit American interest, and we have to take them out. So, you take them out by arresting them, you take them out by, in areas where you cannot reach them by sending drones. This is a fact that we're living, we have to live with, and we have to live with for many years to come. And I think we need to utilize all these tools in the toolbox. Now, the definition, maybe lawyers can come with a lot fancier definition than war or conflict or something. But that's something that we're going to be living with for a while. We have been living with it since the 90s, actually. We were involved in the 90s in so many operations very similar to these type of operations. However, it wasn't viewed as part of a war. It was viewed, as the general was saying, we were working very closely with the military to grab people who were involved sometimes with Qaeda operations or targeting the United States interests around the world. And we brought them back to justice, or we rendered them to a third country. But that was happening before, and now it seems the same thing is going to be happening down the road, but I think under some different type of definition and legal blueprint. But I think for a long period of time, I hate to say, we're going to be involved in this conflict, and it's going to be facing us every day.
So one last question before I open it up to the audience for questions, and at the great risk of mentioning Congress. So there are a number of members on the Hill, or representatives, and others as well, scholars who write in this area and so forth, who say not only should we not repeal the existing AUMF, we should pursue amended or new authority to use military force, because the old AUMF, after all, was tied toward the attacks of 9/11 and the organizations and persons responsible for those attacks. And as the core al-Qaeda, if not disappears, at least shrinks in power and numbers and so forth, and these other threats emerge, some of which are tied to al-Qaeda, others of which have really no relation or much less relation to do with al-Qaeda, if only ideological relations with al-Qaeda. And that what we should do is not just rely on the president's authority, but have Congress expand or name a new list of groups so that we can continue at least to engage in global detention, interrogation, lethal targeting operations for counterterrorism. Is that the right plan, John?
Well, I'll tell you, I've somewhat changed my view on this, in part in light of what we've been seeing in the shutdown over the last couple of weeks. I think I was one of the earliest people. I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about 3 years ago, right about now, in 2010, saying, look, the AUMF had gotten to be very long in the tooth. It was only, as I said, 50, 60 words long. It was written very rapidly after 9/11, and a whole lot of stuff had been hung on it, including detention of a lot of people, drone strikes, killing of Americans through drone strikes, none of which the AUMF said anything about. So, lawyers had concluded that it was a broad law and that it could be used for these purposes. But it really was tied to 9/11. And a lot of things were being done that weren't actually mentioned in it. So my view at the time was that, here's the big if we could do good government, that Congress should get together and revise the statute, because we wanted the president, if he was going to be engaging in military operations, to have congressional approval for what he was doing, and that after 10 years of counterterrorism operations, that the statute ought to be revised to have a clearer law, not necessarily to expand it, but just to make it clearer, so that Congress says, all right, here's the authority that we want the president to be exercising. And it could have limits in it. For example, if there was detention authority, or we were authorizing the actual killings of Americans like Anwar al-Awlaki, that there could be clear process laid out in it before anything could happen. But I have subsequently come to the conclusion that, in fact, Congress cannot do good government. And that it's really maybe better just to leave this law where it is now from 12 years ago. I mean, the odd thing is that we're going to then be operating under this 12-year-old law for, as the general said, at least the next 5 years. It could be another 10 years under an ancient statute. I don't think that is good government, but we cannot get Democrats and Republicans together to sort of agree on what that authorization might look like. We can't even get them to agree to fund the government. So I think I've revised my view on the AUMF. I certainly don't think it can be repealed. I really don't know what the New York Times was saying when they said, "Well, just repeal." I don't know whether they plan to pull the military home. They're not thinking. But I certainly wouldn't repeal it. But I think it's probably just not practically possible to revise it.
I agree. I don't think it should be revised. I don't think it needs to be revised. I actually think the language is flexible. I mean, it talks about the groups that were responsible for 9/11. I think it is fairly read as a legal matter to include, for example, like say we went to war against Germany, and the Congress declared war against Germany, and then Italy entered the war, or Japan entered the war. Congress would need to declare war again against Italy and Japan. That it is the same war, and these are new. So I think the language of the AUMF as it is has the flexibility to include, and this is what we've seen, is that there is at least one other group, AQAP, the AQ branch in Yemen, that has entered the fight with Al Qaeda. I mean, I'm not sure that they really are an associated firm. I think they are, sort of just an offshoot or branch of the core Al Qaeda group. But in any event, if a group enters the fight against us with Al Qaeda, and not just that they enter a war with Al Qaeda, but are planning or are fighting us, that they can be included in the language of the AUMF. With that flexibility, I don't think it needs revision. I certainly don't think it needs expansion, and I don't think I think expanding to other groups is sort of a solution looking for a problem. We don't yet have, at least as far as I am aware, there is not yet the basis for an authorization for use of force against someone.
Last thoughts before we open the press.
I think we live in a totally different world today. I mean, we live in a world where we have non-state actors more powerful than states. We have non-state actors that can threaten regional stability and global stability. You know, Hezbollah is more strong than any country in the Middle East today. In the Arab world, you have Hamas, you have Al Qaeda, you have Qaeda offshoots, you have Boko Haram, creating a tremendous amount of instability in West Africa. Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, in Mali and the Sahel region. Look at what's happening in Libya. You have a group of guys decided that they don't like the prime minister, so they went and they kidnapped him. So this is the world that we live in today, and with this world, we cannot just depend on the traditional laws of international relations and sovereignties. And so when you have non-state actors, when you have individuals who want to do us harm in regions that is washed by weapons and violence and chaos, we need to do something. And I think this is where these legislations and authorities become extremely helpful. The world that we live in today, very different than the world that we lived in 20 years ago. And this is what's scary, that these non-state actors are in so many ways more powerful than states. From the Taliban to Al Qaeda in Iraq, to Al Qaeda in Yemen, to Hezbollah, to Hamas. All these groups have their own agenda, and eventually their agenda is going to contradict with global security and regional stability.
Yeah, just briefly, I would absolutely agree with that. I think as we look back to the era before 9/11, Al Qaeda was focused in Afghanistan and to a slight extent in the Pakistani border area. Today, Al Qaeda is metastasized in a variety of countries around the world. In some ways, it's more dangerous. It's certainly decentralized. And I think more broadly, instability is growing, not decreasing in this world we're in, which is a bit different than certainly what I thought in the 1990s, where we were in a bit of a more halcyon type environment. But this is disturbing, and so I think our ability to operate to disrupt these actors around the world is going to continue to be very, very important, both on the law enforcement side and sharpening those tools and building on what we've learned in the last decade, and on the military side as well.
Thank you. Tremendous. So I want to make sure we have time for a lot of questions. Students, don't make me call on you. Let me take questions from the audience, if any of you have them, for any of our speakers. Yeah, Kayla.
Stand up and a little louder.
It is legitimacy. I mean, I've been an executive branch lawyer, as I think Mary will probably agree with me on this. I mean, we think the president under his Article 2 has pretty broad powers under the Constitution to protect the country. And certainly if one is engaging in counterterrorism operations, there's broad constitutional power. That said, both as a legal matter and a political matter, the president is both stronger legally and politically. Certainly if anything is challenged in court, but in terms of legitimacy, if Congress has authorized what he's doing. And so it's very surprising to me that, I mean, again, I probably shouldn't keep harping on the New York Times and using them as sort of a whipping boy, but if we do what they suggest, which is to immediately repeal the AUMF, then tomorrow they're going to be saying, well, but the president shouldn't be doing all of these things under his constitutional authorities. They ought to be authorized by Congress. And so certainly if the United States is doing aggressive things around the world, whether it is drone strikes killing people, drone strikes killing foreigners, drone strikes killing Americans, soft forces going in to other countries, and it's going to be going on for a period of time, I would rather have that authorized by Congress. Again, as I've said, the ideal would be that Congress authorizes specifically what the president is doing. That's the ideal, the way the system is supposed to work. If our system is in such gridlock that we cannot get the elected representatives of the American people to pass an improved law, I guess I would rather them hang it off a law that clearly authorizes these things generally. But I wouldn't want to just fall back, even though legal, to answer your question, just on constitutional authority.
Pamela? Yeah.
Yes. I guess along those lines, simultaneously while the president made that speech, he also was prosecuting government officials for using as spies. So I guess my question is, are we choosing, when he chooses to repeal the AOM or AOMS, are we choosing between either doing it covertly, completely without public knowledge whatsoever, without transparency, or are we choosing Congress and whether
Is that for me? No, I think if I understand your question, I mean, I think that the preference, as I said in the president's speech, I think one of the elements that he mentioned was in the framework was a preference for use of military. Actually, I'm not sure if he mentioned it or if it's come out in other John Brennan and other comments, but preference for use of military over covert operations, when possible, for the reason that they're able to have more transparency when using the military. On the leaks issue, I mean, I don't think. So your concern is that if the AUMF is repealed, then more things will be done covertly, and that there will be less transparency. I mean, I think that's fair. I don't think that's where we're headed, but I think that's a fair concern. Is that and that it is good for the country if more of the things that we do in this context, in this war, in this area can be explained publicly, acknowledged publicly. So I think a move, in that way, move towards the military or other, and away from covert operations is a positive one.
So the question is detention authority in particular. It arises, interestingly in lots of ways. The AOMF has been interpreted by the Supreme Court and other courts to authorize detention for the duration of hostilities under international law, right, as interpreted in line with the Geneva Conventions. The hostilities that were authorized by the AOMF are the hostilities against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces with some wiggle room. We're still detaining people at Guantanamo, for example. We're going to pull out of Afghanistan within the year. Can we continue to detain the people at Guantanamo under the AUMF authority beyond the end of that particular war? At what point, right, if the legal standard is for the duration of hostilities, and at some point that detention has to end, what point is that? And I suppose more broadly, the detention question.
I'll start. I think it's one of the most complicated questions that there is about the president's vision and vision of many people, I think, of ending the war, that this war will end at some point. What happens then? The hardest part of that is you know, when does the detention authority end? I mean, I think obviously this president would have preferred to clear out Guantanamo well in advance of when that would be legally required, or you know, that the administration believes it would be legally required, but for many reasons that is not happening. But so I mean, I do think whenever it is that the AUMF authority goes away, then I think you have a very serious legal question about what to do. You know, and then under the law of armed conflict, there's time there continues to be some period of time that you can hold under international law, hold detainees, but we've got to let them go at some point when the war ends, so I don't know.
Take a stab. I mean, this is, as Mary said, this is a question that has bedeviled both administrations on detention and the legal basis, and has caused great angst around the world. I mean, I've certainly talked to hundreds of thousands of Europeans unhappy with our detention policy. On this particular issue, if the president declares the war in Afghanistan to be over, which I think he is going to do, then there's at least an argument that the authority to detain the Taliban, who were part of the war in Afghanistan, ends. I would have to think about a contrary argument, but if the war in Afghanistan and the Taliban were the army of Afghanistan is over, then under customary international law, you'd have to let them go. As I understand it, Mary can correct me, both administrations have actually argued that there are actually two conflicts going on. There was a conflict in Afghanistan with the Taliban that may be over, but just because the conflict in Afghanistan is over, there's a conflict with al-Qaeda going on around the world. Al-Qaeda was not fighting on behalf of the government of Afghanistan. They were fighting for themselves. And as Ali has said, the major new phenomenon that's a big problem is we have all these people who are not fighting for anybody but an ideology. And so the conflict with al-Qaeda continues. And so I think the position of the administration will be that there continues to be authority under the AUMF and under customary international law to detain members of al-Qaeda, including newly captured ones like al-Libi or Warsami, under the laws of war, because there's a conflict going on with al-Qaeda. If at such time we declare the war with al-Qaeda to be over, something that I don't expect to happen anytime soon, then there really wouldn't be any detention authority at all.
Yeah, if I just add one comment on that, I think there's a very good chance that the United States will not be at war with the Taliban after December 2014. Just in case you're unaware, we also do have an American who's being held by the Taliban for about the last 4.5 years or so, named Bo Bergdahl, who disappeared off his base in eastern Afghanistan back around 08-09. So he'll be in some fashion a part of this equation. And again, I think you're going to see, I tend to agree with John, I think you're going to see the high probability of the president announcing an end to that war against the Taliban alone by December of next year.
Well, I think one question that Congress actually has asked the administration, which the administration has not answered, at least publicly, is who do you think we are at war with other than al-Qaeda? And so I think what they're saying is, all right, we accept that you're at war with al-Qaeda and you can detain al-Qaeda members, you can kill al-Qaeda members, but and we also recognize that in the AUMF, as Mary said, that there are co-belligerent groups, that if a group is clearly fighting alongside with al-Qaeda, that it's really just the same as al-Qaeda. But they're saying, well, what about these newly metastasized groups that the general has mentioned that really didn't exist in 2001? And You know, you may have people who are now 18 who were 8 at the time, who were part of groups that didn't exist in Al-Shabaab in Somalia or some other groups in Yemen. And the Congress has said, well, are you at war with them too? And can you detain them? And so I personally think this is where really I would like to have a little bit of greater clarity between Congress and the executive so that we really know, you know, who is at war with whom, and can we use force and detain members of some of those other. I just think I'm a big person on clarity.
Well, I think just to talk about the affiliates, I mean, there are affiliates who are not really part of Al-Qaeda and they never pledged bay'ah to the organization. But also you have other affiliates who pledged bay'ah to the organization, and the bay'ah is extremely important. It is actually the contract. It's a terrorism contract that an organization is doing with Al-Qaeda Central. Al-bay'ah is the base of every conspiracy we have against Al-Qaeda in even the court of laws here in the United States. So you have many organizations that pledged bay'ah. For example, the global jihadi faction of Al-Shabaab that's now in control of Al-Shabaab organization, Gudan, pledged bay'ah to Ayman Zawahiri. Abu Muhammad al-Julani in Syria pledged bay'ah. Abu Bakr Baghdadi, the ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, pledged bay'ah. So you have this organization. Now, doesn't mean that all this organization who believe in the declaration of jihad in 1996, that's what the bay'ah is, that you lead us because we believe in what you're telling us, that the legal religious thesis against the United States is stated in the declaration of jihad that Osama bin Laden issued in August 23rd, 1996, and then verified with the fatwa of February of 1998. This is what they are swearing allegiance to Al-Qaeda on. These things basically put the group definitely under the umbrella of Al-Qaeda, and we need to focus on them. Now, Al-Shabaab, for example, is not a monolithic organization. There are many different factions in Al-Shabaab that's very nationalistic. They only want to focus on Somalia, and they are not part of the global jihadi network. So this is where the confusion can get to the administration and trying to explain, well, this faction of Al-Shabaab or that faction of Al-Shabaab. You're talking about, we're 12 years after 9/11. Who can name me 5 people from the Shura Council of Al-Qaeda? So you want to go down to the details and saying, oh, this guy or not this guy. Or Boko Haram. You know, we're talking about the Boko Haram or the Ansaru faction of Boko Haram. We're talking about Tawheed al-Jihad or al-Murabitun Brigade. You're talking about ISIS or al-Nusra. So, I mean, we get stuck into the details. However, we have the intelligence community, the military, the law enforcement community. We have a lot of investigations going on into the people who wanted to harm United States interests, attacking American embassies, attacking American consulates, killing United States citizens, trying to conduct operations inside the United States, such as Al-Qaeda in Yemen, for example, AQAP. They attempted to do that a few times. Those individuals, they expect to be targeted by the United States. And we'll continue to keep targeting them, because by targeting them, we're actually saving a lot of American lives. But doesn't mean that we go to northern Nigeria and, you know, try to fight another entity that operates under Al-Qaeda but actually doesn't have that bay'ah concept with Al-Qaeda. So this is where I think it gets very complicated in trying to transparently explain it to the American people. Because, you know what, we would like to fit everything in specific, you know, boxes on a sheet and know, okay, this is the enemy. It's very flexible over there. Alliance is very flexible. You know, some people are today with Al-Qaeda, tomorrow they are giving Qaeda guys to you. You know, so you have to be very flexible with your targeting. You have to be very flexible with your laws and with your strategy in combating such a fluid enemy.
Let me, we have time for, unfortunately, just one last question, and it has to be brief and responses will be brief. I know Mary has to catch a train, so we're going to let her go, and I know the rest will be around after. Deborah, did you have a question? Yeah, okay, quickly though. there a war or is not a war? Last question. Is there any final comment?
That's a great question. If I understand your question, Gabor, I don't know how much it helps with the international community to know that there is a U.S. domestic law that concludes that there is an armed conflict. I mean, we are more comfortable generally in the United States if there is a domestic law that is authorizing our activities rather than just relying on constitutional authorities. I would generally think that other countries would be more comfortable if there is a statute that is authorizing our activities. On the other hand, I also get the point, because I've heard about it for 4 years perpetually from, particularly from Europeans, that they just don't buy that we are in an armed conflict. The whole debate about drones, for example, which is a subject of a whole another conference, is really not about targeted killings. People think it's about targeted killings because it sounds bad. But as the general will tell you, if we're in something that we accept to be a war, if we were in World War II and we had a weapon that would only kill the one person and no one else, everybody would say targeted killings are wonderful. The issue is not about targeted killings. Targeted killings are good in war. The problem is people around the world don't believe that the United States is in an armed conflict. And so there continues to be a debate around the world whether the whole armed conflict model that the United States, through 2 administrations and affirmed by our judges all the way up to the Supreme Court, that we're in an armed conflict model, is something that is not accepted by a lot of people around the world. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for a remarkable.
Good session.
And please join us in the lobby for a light reception after the fact. Thank you.